Welcome to the fourth of the Gifford lectures. The lecture this evening will be recorded. It will be available online on the Gifford website, and I now have extreme pleasure handing you over to Professor Gazzaniga.
This slide I was asked to put up, and if you can read it, you don't have to see your optometrist in the near future. But it's supposed to advertise that the video version of this, where all of the wanderings and malapropism have been edited out and everything sounds coherent, is available. The first one's available on the website. So tonight's lecture is on a topic that everybody in this room has an opinion about and usually freely expresses it. And this is my attempt to try to come to grips with the issue of commonly put as free will, and I'm trying to change it a little bit and turn the question around and say, what is the meaning of being free in the 21st century? And so quickly again, we've come from earlier lectures from the notion that our functionality is automatic, that our modularized selected brains has a narrative capability created by the left hemisphere interpreter, which in turn gives rise to the illusion of the unity of purpose, and leading to the tension that we live in a post-hoc world. And tonight we're going to look at the scope of the argument for determinism. Are we just along for the ride is the underlying question. Why none of us believe it. And time to restate the human condition by asking, free from what? What exactly do we mean by this concept? So we're going to try to offer some thoughts on understanding freedom and responsibility in the modern world. And to do that, we will be looking at questions of the level of organization problem, the idea of emergence and emergent minds and downward causation, and basically, how does the mind constrain the brain? So let's start with the common definition of free will. From philosophy, the belief that human behavior is an expression of personal choice and is not determined by physical forces, fate, or God. In other words, there is a you, a self, a person calling the shots. There is a command center where you're doing the job. You're doing everything. You are making all the moral and ethical and routine decisions of functioning in your culture. And you're free from outside causes. You are the big you, are doing things. And freedom from outside control, you can be free from coercion, compulsion, delusions, and lack of control over one's acts. So it's a very fundamental, profound concept that our culture has, and its origins have been with us for, depending on who you read, for hundreds and hundreds of years. So now, though, we're 21st century citizens, and we have a different set of beliefs. We do believe brains do enable minds, and that you is your vastly parallel and distributed brain. I would say most of us are committed roughly to that idea. And there are no ghosts in the system. There's no funny business going on that comes in and energizes this from the outside, like sort of the cartoon of a cloud over the head. And to some extent, when Lord Gifford said, give these lectures without reference to or reliance upon any supposed special, exceptional, or so-called miraculous revelation, well, he meant in a slightly different context, the notion that there's something else, some other substance in there controlling the brain is what's at stake. And I think, again, most 20th century views would deny that. So the question then really comes down to, what does it mean to be free? What on earth do we even mean by that? Free from what is the way to think about it. What is it you want to be free from when the people continue to talk about this question of free will? And I raise the question that is the question of free will a poorly framed question. And so what we're going to do this evening is look at functional everyday freedom, you and me functioning in our society, how it works, appreciating the concepts of emergence I want to get across, grasping the importance of interactions in the social world and what that delivers us on this question, and identifying and understanding downward causation, a tremendously important question in philosophy, and I will take a shot at it. And then one of the things we will be doing is eliminating the importance of some concepts physical determinism and its role in understanding the free will debate, I think, is going to be put to rest and has been by many and continues to be critiqued, and I will do that. And in the end, when we do all of this, we're going to come up with a notion that and retain why humans are to be held accountable, something I firmly believe in, that all of the science and all of the activities that we're carrying out in no way undermines that key concept. So, what scientists and determinists thought they knew, and think they know in many quarters, is that there's scientific reductionism leading to determinism and therefore questionable responsibility. This is the question that beleaguers many people and they worry about. And I'm going to call this the bleak view of what we're about and what we're doing. And why is that? Well, people hold on to this because we believe definitely that there's automatic processes. We believe, we have no problem believing that our cellular systems, the way our genes get expressed and into proteins and function and all the rest, we have no belief those go on automatically. Thank goodness they're not under any control of ours. But somehow when you start to talk about automatic processes moving up levels and into the brain, people don't like that idea. They simply do not like that idea and do not accept it with the same rapidity that they will accept the notion that there are automatic processes and basic cellular processes. So why? Why we find it hard to look at this question of automaticity when it comes to neuronal function? And it's because of the major implication. By the time one is consciously aware of something, the brain has already done the work. That is the implication. By the time you have a thought, it's already happened in your brain and you're sort of on a little bit of a tape delay, and that's kind of a bothersome thought. And so the notion would be then that because of that, we are free riders. Our mental work, our mental life isn't doing any work. It's just going along from one physical state to the next, and raises the question: are we sort of not zombies? And of course, saying that and laying it out like that, everybody in the audience probably, I would assume, has the strict reaction that that's just simply not how I think, how it works, and no one actually believes it. No one believes that we're just sitting around letting life happen. We have this firm commitment to the notion we're involved. And why? Well, we mentioned this in last Thursday's lecture, and that I would tie it again to this important idea of the interpreter. There's something in the brain that tries to figure out the meaning of behavior that continues, that pours out of us emotional states, actual behavior, and we build a theory. So after something happens, this interpreter comes in and adds that action to our personal narrative, and we incorporate that idea, and we believe, of course, that it is us that is ultimately doing it. And think about that. Even though that happens after the fact, we can back refer that in time to when we assumed the act was being willed. So one can actually do experiments where you take a sequence of an event. So let's say we're going to poke a button, and we know that 500 milliseconds before we decide to do that, there's a Bryer-Scheff potential in the brain building up, a readiness potential. And as we get closer and closer to it, there's other activities we could go into and spell out. And then we actually start seeing movement, 41 millisecond, and the muscles, that there's a beginning to be a response. And then finally, there's the actual movement down here at 0 time. So there's this whole sequence leading up to the actual movement. But Lau at Oxford and now at Columbia University showed that during this 200 milliseconds actually after the movement, it's over, it's done, it's happened. If you disrupt the brain in particular areas through this transcranial magnetic stimulation method, that in fact what happens is people, I think what's happening there is he's manifestly messing with the interpreter, and so the back referencing in time that occurs just takes that and pushes it back in time. And he can show very nicely how that all works. So when we think we've done something after the fact, We're just really taking that assumption and pushing it back in time. We're referencing back in our temporal maps of when things are happening and and gives us this sensation that we freely willed it before the fact. And you say, well, that's kind of a wild idea, but it's a commonplace idea, actually. If you look at the simple mechanisms of pain in the body, when you hurt your hand, where your system figures out that your hand has been hurt is up here in your brain, and it refers the pain out here in your hand. So we constantly refer things to spatial locations. We constantly refer referring things to not where the site is where it happened. So this notion of free will, this notion of free will is obviously throughout our culture. We believe in it. We all think we possess it. And it's obviously reinforced by the fact that systems, societies, everything seems to work better when people believe that that's the way the world works. In a recent clever little experiment by Vos and Schuyler, they took undergraduates and they were to play a little game, a little video game. And as they played that game, there was an option to cheat to gain more money if you chose to. So what they did was they take two groups of students. One group of students, prior to going into the room to take the test, were just given reading material, and it was Francis Crick's book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, which has this sort of a deterministic bias to it, kind of, it's all done before you know it kind of book. And so students would read this, and then they'd go in and take the test. And another group of students would read a very uplifting, positive book about goodwill and purpose and so forth, and then they would go take the test. And lo and behold, guess what happened? The students who read the determinism book, the notion that you're just sitting around for the ride, cheated like crazy during the test, and the other ones who read the uplifting book about good purpose in life did not. So this is a concept that not only do we believe it just sensationally at a level of phenomenal self, but it's obviously one that's good for everybody involved, so no one really questions it in a serious way. But at the level of university life and science and all these things that we do in philosophy, is that just sort of simply happy talk about free will? I mean, that's fine, but hasn't there been this march in our understanding of the world and how things work towards determinism? And sort of the hardliners just sort of put it to you. They say, just as the world is not flat, humans are not free. Just as the world is not flat, get over it. The world is not free. Get over it. Get beyond it. That's just the way it is. And so there's been this long march towards scientific reductionism over the years. And let me just remind you that so much of it sprang out of Europe. And when you consider Copernicus and deciding that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, and René Descartes with his highly biological mechanical rules about the function of the body, got the mind-brain thing wrong, but the actual laws involved in the systemic biology, he was right on top of it. Charles Darwin, of course, with natural selection. All of these things led to a determinism along with Freud and Einstein's theoretical work. All of it point us towards the importance of determinism. And finally along comes, in the last 100 years, neuroscience, which has a gazillion studies, again, which point us in that direction. And so there's been an assault on this notion of free will, that there is this firm sense of determinism that is building around us. And I'd just like to make the side point that while Darwin is the most fabulous biologist that ever lived, and obviously his work today impacts everything that goes on as much as it did the day he discovered it, I would like to offer and remind everybody of the importance of Newton and the importance that grew out of his 3 laws of determinism, and that this is the question that keeps pounding on us as we want to believe where we fit in the sense of what is the nature of our responsibility when we carry out an act. Certainly tight determinism has been pushed by many through the years. If you look at Spinoza, Spinoza said there is no mind, absolute or free will, but the mind is determined for willing this or that by a cause which is determined in its turn by another cause, and this one again by another, and so on to infinity. A very strong view about the matter, as did Einstein. Einstein said, in human freedom in the philosophical sense, I am definitely a disbeliever. Everybody acts not only under external compulsion, but also in accordance with inner necessity. So the notion of determinism is everywhere. It comes out of chaos theory, the initial conditions problem. We get the butterfly effect. A butterfly moves its wings in China, and you have an espresso in Rome. People hold on to this, and you know this little poem, for want of a nail in the shoe is lost, for want of a shoe the horse is lost, for want of a horse the rider is lost, for want of a rider the battle is lost, for want of a battle the kingdom is lost, and all for the loss of a horseshoe nail. So this looks random, but it is highly determined, and this is a dominant view, as I said, in the scientific community. So let's think about that. Okay, let's take their view, and let's run it by, and let's see just a quick look at neuroscience. It basically is supportive of some understanding of determinism. And let me come at it by asking the question, and generally, what is the brain for? Now, this is a question that you would think most neuroscientists could answer like that. But in fact, it's not. They don't think about it that much. But what it is they think about it, the subparts. But what is the brain for is the underlying question is, it's a decision-making device. It's there to make decisions. And so it has to gather information from all kinds of sources in order to make a proper decision from moment to moment, second to second. It is a decision-making device. And if you just think about it, here's a skeletal view of the human body, and we can do an experiment. Stick out your hand, touch the tip of your nose, and you will have the sensation that, in fact, your nose and the tip of your finger were touched at the same time. But in fact, the neuron that identifies that you were touched at the tip of your finger is about 3.5 feet long, and your nose neuron to the processes that go on to make this comparison are 2 or 3 inches long. And yet there's this sense of simultaneity. So the information is gathered 250, 500 milliseconds, people argue about this, computed, a decision is made, and you get the sensation of conscious experience. That's conscious experience, and it comes together after the information has been gathered. So you can see evidence of this all over. I'll give you an example from our own research. Let me put those up. Whoop. So you ask a person, look at fixate a point, and you flash a stimulus in the right visual field, which goes to their left hemisphere. And if you look at intact people, which is to say everybody in this room with their corpus callosum, you see that there's immediate activation of the visual cortex in the left hemisphere, and through time, this is 100 milliseconds after the flash, 124, then 148, through time, you see the information spread over to the other hemisphere. And then you do the same test on the split brain patients that we've been talking about all last week, do the same test, you see the activation in the left hemisphere, but because the brain has been divided, the activation remains localized in the left hemisphere. So therefore, we can identify the actual pathways involved in gathering the information. These things take time, and through time, gathering the information for decision making. And this is a reference to the famous work of Benjamin Libet, who 25, 30 years ago now, working at the University of California, San Francisco, demonstrated that during the course of neurosurgical procedures where the patient was awake, he could stimulate the actual cortical surface that represents sensation from the hand, and it wasn't until 500 milliseconds later that the patient felt the sensation. There was a processing time. There's time to consciousness is the idea. So Sir Charles Sherrington made an interesting observation that takes us into other modern imaging ways to look at this question. Sir Charles Sherrington said, in looking for mind and energy, we are not looking for a form of energy then to translate it into mind. What we look for is an energy which is mind. Now, that is a very complex set of concepts there. And for the moment, I'm going to read it as that we can say that the new imaging techniques are doing the latter. They are, in fact, indicating that the energy that is being recorded in these new brain scans is the mental processes that we are experiencing. And William James, in 1890, said, "We must suppose a very delicate adjustment whereby the circulation follows the needs of cerebral activity. Blood very likely may rush to each region of the cortex according as it's most active, but of this we know nothing." So over 100 years ago, William James, who said everything correctly from what I can figure out, predicted that there might be a way to capture blood flow to be an indicant of mental processes in the human brain. And of course, as we all know, because of the vast importance of obviously the blood supply to the human cerebral cortex and to mental processes, we're now able to do this through using magnetic resonance imaging, where we're actually tracking the oxygen level of blood to figure out what the nervous system is doing, which is to be a reflection, of course, of what mental processes are. So using these processes, as we've demonstrated before, we now no longer look at the brain as we did 40 years ago as a static system, but we can look at it and see it as this dynamic, ever-changing system that is constantly in motion and in action through these blood measures. And using blood flow measures, excuse me. And using these techniques, very ingenious experiments are done. This is work by John Dillon Haynes and his group at Oxford, where they're basically looking at the mechanisms that are involved in making a particular choice, and they can find the antecedents they maintain up to 10 seconds before an act is made. By looking at the MRI and seeing the pattern of results, they can make a prediction with high accuracy what the person is going to do. So the notion is it's all in there, it's all happening, and when you think you're willing it uniquely at the end, that's just an illusion. Actually, the brain's taking care of the whole deal for you. And there's another, just last year, another article by Chris Frith and his colleagues that got the attention of The Guardian, and where they were extremely concerned about the fact that people can read people's intentions. And of course, as you think about this, this is a very fascinating topic, and will be brought up in my last lecture as to how this will apply in the legal system and to the judicial process. So here, when you add all that up together, here's what you get. You get the causal chain claim, as I call it. The brain enables the mind, and the brain is a physical entity. The physical world is determined, so our brains must also be determined. If our brains are determined, and if the brain is the necessary and sufficient organ that enables the mind, then we are left with the belief that our thoughts that arise from our mind are also determined. Thus, since free will is an illusion, we must revise our concept of what it means to be personally responsible for our actions. There's the hard view. And put differently, the concept of free will has no meaning. It just was an idea that came up. No one knew all this other stuff about the way we work. Why don't we get rid of it? So that leads us to this refrain. Free from what? When you think about what do we want to be free from? We don't want to be free from our experience of life. We don't want to be free from our temperament. We don't want to be free from this or that, the other thing. What is it we want to be free from? So this topic, of course, draws everybody's attention, and I wanted to mention two people, again, Sir John Eccles and Donald Mackay. And this last picture here is a placeholder for me, in that I'm trying to get up on the top of a mountain with these guys. So I don't know if I'm going to make it. Anyway, and I'm going to talk about the system a bit differently from this socially emergent downward causation point. So first, Sir John Eccles had this idea and model, and Deus ex machina, I say. All of a sudden, he has a complex model built on physiology, his life work, brilliant work in neurophysiology. And then at the end, he felt that somehow mental processes landed on the supplementary motor areas of the left hemisphere, and the brain just hopped to these set of commands, and that's how the mind-brain problem was explained. Don Mackay, I think, was almost on the money. I think he almost spelled it out, and I wish he was with us so that we could have this discussion. Don Mackay pointed out that he recognized that the brain is a mechanical, it's clockwork, as he put it. The subjective I is embodied in the brain. We can control what we can evaluate. We do not control our brains, we control our behavior. And the only problem I have is this we that he keeps coming back to. What is that? How would he define it as opposed to myself and others? But in doing so, we have to look very carefully at how one in neuroscience would try to go after and define and understand what a neuroscience, a brain science claim would be on this issue of determinism. How does it work? So this allows me to explain somebody's work that I think raises a profound problem for neuroscience and why we are led ultimately to the need for the concept of emergence. And its underlying issue is determining the correct level of analysis. And it is the first time I've seen in neuroscience where the notion of multiple realizability, which is a clear philosophical concept that there's many ways to have the same output, it's really been worked out to be true in a simple animal by Eve Martyr. And what she does is work on how the gut of a lobster requires eating a lot of lobster. The gut of a lobster contracts through its very simple nervous system. And in fact, what she does is she's literally isolated the entire network, knows every synapse in it, knows the entire innervation pattern. This is, you can't see it, but this is the anatomy that shows the various innervations of the muscles involved. And begins to knows every node, and then builds a model of it. And through brute force analysis shows that there's literally millions of combinations of firing and an action at the level of neurotransmitter expression and so forth, that this simple little nervous system could be in to produce the contracted state. And even though there are millions, she also determines that there's between 100 to 200,000 settings of those synapses that would produce the exact same behavior, the exact same phenotypic, as it were, expression, the exact same contraction. So that makes it look like, gee, how are you going to ever be able to capture through your single unit and very molecular approaches, how you're going to be able to capture what is actually going on to produce the behavior. And so there's enormous diversity at the local level, is one way of putting it, leading to common behavioral phenotype. That is a profound problem that all of neuroscience has to think about, how they're going to approach and what level they're going to approach, trying to figure out what the deterministic rules are for understanding the nervous system in this deterministic way. And another problem I just wanted to throw out is that neuroscientists have tried for years to understand maybe the brain code by understanding how information from one point gets to another, and very simply by sticking an electrode between the two. There's a problem with this as outlined by the very simple fact that how information gets shuttled around the internet. When you send out a piece of information and you want it to go from point A to point B, as most of you know, the information is divided up and sent down 3 different pathways. And it finally winds up with it properly addressed at the end. It gets reassembled. The internet was built that way on purpose. And so if you're putting your electrode down one of these links and you're trying to figure out how the information gets from A to B, you're going to have a tough time because you're not seeing all the information that's involved in the expression at the end. So I just wanted to point out that the neuroscientists have their work cut out for them to capture how this is going to how this is going to support and build a theory for underlying determinism of an act. So this leads to the wonderful cartoon by Robert Laughlin. Simple determinism is preposterous. Here's a little boy on a merry-go-round. Here's two guys walking along, talking about how free they are, and he's about to get conked with that yo-yo, and life is going to be a different thing. And to say that you could understand that in a deterministic framework is laughable. So we go then from primitive determinism to emergence, this interesting concept. And determinism has supplanted dualism in the brain sciences, there's no question about it, yet falls short of explaining behavior and our sense of personal responsibility and freedom. Determinism in the physical sciences has been challenged by the principle of emergence. Now, emergence is a common phenomenon that is accepted in physics and biology and chemistry, but it's been very resisted in neuroscience, and I'll come to that. But the notion that not so fast with the determinism, of course, started years ago with the classical challenge by quantum mechanics, and as set forth here in two Gifford lectures by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. Bohr says the renunciation of the idea of causality in atomic physics has been forced upon us. And Heisenberg said, I believe that indeterminism, that is necessary and not just consistently possible. So way back, kind of starting the groundwork for this notion is that this whole notion of determinism can't capture it because of these quantum mechanical problems. And Richard Feynman, the great physicist, said, yes, physics has given up. We do not know to predict what would happen in a given circumstance, and we believe now that it is impossible, that the only thing that can be predicted is the probability of different events. It must be recognized that this is a retrenchment of our earlier ideal of understanding nature. It may be a backward step. That is impossible to beat the puzzle, that this is the way nature really is. So there's this idea that something's happening here that we can't capture in this bottom-up approach. Here is a wonderful seminal paper by Philip Anderson in 1972. Really kicked this off, and people began to see the importance of emergence on this question. He writes, the main fallacy in this kind of thinking is that the reductionist hypothesis does not by any means imply a constructionist one. The ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws does not imply the ability to start from those laws and reconstruct the universe. In fact, the more the elementary particle physicists tell us about the nature of the fundamental laws, the laws' relevance they seem to have to the very real problems of the rest of science, much less to those of society. So Anderson is saying you just simply can't get there by studying the micro story. You can't get to the macro story, even though it's a macro story, and people commonly use here from biology the example of the anthill. You could study the ants till you're blue in the face, and you wouldn't be able to predict that they wind up producing such things. So Robert Laughlin, the Nobel laureate, and wrote a wonderful book on this topic, summarizes it very briefly. What we're seeing is a transformation of worldview in which the objective of understanding nature by breaking it down into ever smaller parts is supplanted by the objective of understanding how nature organizes itself. So if we take stock here, here's how I see it. There's a complete theoretical understanding of the microscopic constituents does not suggest a new set of general theories for how they get put together into interesting macromolecular structures. That nature does it is in no way in question, but whether we can theorize, predict, understand this process is to Feynman highly improbable, and Anderson and Laughlin believe it is impossible. So that is a pretty profound set of claims, that the simple upwardly causal constructionist view that understanding the nervous system will allow us to understand all the rest of it is not the way to think about the problem. And then the question is, what do we do for a living? Who are these killjoys? You know, we've been maintaining that, you're not laughing, we've been maintaining that we are going to nail this, and how do you think about this? Well, broken symmetry is everywhere. The idea of symmetry breaking is simple. Matter collectively and spontaneously acquires a property or preference not present in the underlying rules themselves. That's what we're talking about. That's what emergence is. And as I said, it's an easy concept in physics, biology, chemistry, sociology, but it's resisted in neuroscience. And the question is why? And the reason is because if you bring it into neuroscience, there's an implication, there is a ghost in the machine. There's something in there doing the work, and it isn't the brain. It's not the intention. It's not the right way to think about it. But I think that's why there's resistance. And we know emergence, as I said, is all over physics. Newton's laws are basically emergent, since you can't predict the Newtonian phenomenon by looking at the quantum mechanics. So here's one way I think about this, and that is to use the metaphor of when we come to think about how the brain may be involved in the process of choosing and of responsibility and this whole notion. Think of it this way: cars are automatic. Give me that. Cars are automatic. Now, analysis of traffic cannot be achieved by studying cars in isolation. A new set of laws emerge from cars in group motion. It's called traffic. And I have a wonderful demonstration of this, that there's no way, by understanding cars, you're going to understand traffic. And what it gets at is that, how we're going to think it is that brains are not free. Brains are not free. They're this determined machine. It's people that are free. People is more than one person. People are two and more. Rules start to develop. Things start to happen. And that's where you're going to capture where the notion of freedom is. So first of all, the car metaphor, to show you that in fact a determined system can function at the level of traffic that you would never predict by knowing.
Backed by popular demand, here's some more traffic footage. The last footage I showed, it was actually in Hanoi. Now I'm in Da Nang, which is about halfway down.
There you go.
Six.
So now you think about it in terms of brains. Brains are automatic, is the claim. Analysis of brains cannot illuminate the capacity or responsibility, a dimension of life that comes from social exchange, establishing rules. It's people getting together and agreeing upon things, and the freedom is in that interaction. It's not to be found in your brain. And the whole way of thinking about it, to me, is an error. And if you just take a look at this wonderful barn raising in Amish country, you see that it's the social organization involved and all those independent souls there that allow for that event to occur. You don't think about it in terms of one particular person. It's the interaction. And I just, for relief, show you an incredible thing. If you've ever seen one of these barn raisings, it's the social organization that produces it. It's not the individual. They can put one of these things up in a day. All right, well, you get the idea. So it's people, it's the people interactions is where freedom and responsibility are discovered. It's not simply in the brain. It's very important. It's the interactions of people that is where the problem is to be found, I think, to a large extent, and where it is to be understood. So I want to now explore one last thing this evening about mental states and how they can constrain the brain. This may be another dimension to the problem, and let's see where we go with this. So what we have said is human behavior is an expression of personal choice and is not determined by physical facing. We can take that one off the table by modern standards. And then we have human behavior as the product of a probabilistically determined system which is guided by experience. That's certainly true. But the two that I'm arguing for on the freedom and responsibility question is the phenomena that come out of group interactions when people are involved as opposed to one person, and the mental states selected by the general milieu constrains the brain. A mental state constrains the brain. Now, how can that be? What does that mean even? So, in trying to think this through, I've been enormously helped and aided by David Krakauer, I want to give full credit to here, who's a theoretical biologist at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. And as it's getting from micro B to macro A is the problem. How do you get from the subunits up to the thing that's bigger? How do you have a coherent story there? And there's about 2 or 3 slides here, but I'm going to read it along because I want it to be completely clear on how to think about this. So the trick for any level of analysis is to find the effective variable that contains all the information from below required to generate all the behavior of interest above. This is as much an art as a science. Now, bottom-up causality, going from a B micro level, neurons, to an A macro level of thought, can be both intractable and incomprehensible. Top-down causality refers to the description of A causing B when A is expressed in higher-level effective variables and dynamics, and B in terms of the microscopic dynamics. Physically, all the interactions are microscopic, B to B, but not all the microscopic degrees of freedom matter. So that's a formal way of saying how B can generate A, but A is still part and made up of B. So he gives examples in computer programming. We interface with complex physical system that performs computational work. That's what we do when we're typing on our computer. We do not program at the level of electrons, B, but at the level of a higher effective theory, A, let's say we're using Lisp programming, that is then compiled down without loss of information into the microscopic physics. Thus you can say A causes B. Of course, A is physically made from B, and all the steps of the compilation are just B with B physics. But from our perspective, we can view some collective B behavior in terms of A processes. So it's a very nice way, to me, of stating the problem. And in the level of brain program, he puts it this way. In brain science, we use concepts like anger, tone, and perspective. These are the A coarse-grained variables standing in for B microstates. We work well with the A level due to limitations of our own introspective awareness. Internally, something beyond consciousness does the compiling, so maybe either A or the compiler can be thought of as a language of thought. We are not separate from the machine, but understand ourselves at suitable A levels. Now here's the really crucial part to me. The deeper point is that without these higher levels, there would be no possibility of communication, as we would have to specify every particle we wish to move in the utterance rather than have the mind compiler do the work. So why do things, there's an absolute necessity for this emergence to occur in order to control this teeming, seething system that's going on at another level. So overall then, the idea here is that we have a variety of emergent processes going on from particle physics to atomic physics to chemistry to biochemistry to cell biology to physiology up to the mental, producing the mental. And those are all emergent systems all the way up. And then once the mental states exist, is there anything like a downward causation that somehow having a mental thought, a mental moment somehow constrains the brain that produces it? That's the $64 question in this business. And I think what I want to try to do is offer a thought on this that it might help us think about it. The classic way and puzzle is that goes like this. There's a physical state, and that physical state produces a mental state. Okay? And then at a second time, T2, there is another mental state produced, assumingly, we assume, by a physical state, P2. It goes from P2 to M2. Very simple, very straightforward. The question is, how do you get from M to M2? This is the question that puzzles everybody. And if you just go from P to P2, then we are truly along for the ride, and there seems to be a great tension with that notion. And no one is suggesting that you go from mental state 1 to mental state 2 without going through the brain. So that one's sort of tossed out. But the remaining puzzle is there a way of getting from mental state 1 through some downward constraining process to be guiding to physical state 2? That's the question. And this slowly rising question mark means that it is a tough question. And everybody in this room should have ideas about it and think about it hard, because it is a profound problem. So let me offer you a way of thinking about it. And it has to do, again, my gratitude to David Krakauer for helping think on these issues. We used to think a gene was a very simple sort of system, beads on a string and a chromosome, and when they express themselves, they built something, and let's say it's a tree in this example. And then we now know, of course, that the genes aren't that simple, that there's a multiplicity of events going on. You might say a gene is a computational moment when all kinds of things are going on. So a variety of genes, transcriptions, microRNAs. It's a very complex thing now. But still, it produces something, and let's call it the tree. And then the next tree is produced from another seedling. And if you just look at, well, maybe that next tree will be identical or not, and maybe that'll just be a possible mutation, and we all know about that, and that's simple. But what about the fact that this tree might in some way affect that next genome? What if you think of it as many trees in an environment, and wondering whether somehow one of them has a downwardly causal effect on the next seedling? Well, it turns out when the big tree grows, it's casting shade and other issues, taking resources out of the soil. And so the next trees that grow along are going to be affected by that. And they're going to have a different composition, and they're going to be passing on a different history to the subsequent tree. And so you see that all of a sudden there is a epigenetic environmental milieu impact on which tree actually progresses to the second tree. So let's take this into the brain model. So we know from our last week's lecture that we shouldn't think of P1 leading to M1, but there's P1, P2, Pn. There's all kinds of multiple processes going on simultaneously, generating whatever it does. And they produce mental states, and we're going to call those M, and there's a bunch of them. There's a cloud, there's a constellation of in our mind at all times. And and each of those, will go for fun of it, or not fun of it, the point of it is that those mental states are probably reflecting emergence. And so they are occurring in a complex environment in the world we live in. And the question is, what happens when we get to time 2 now? What happens when we get from P1 to P2 to Pn? How can we think about how the mental states in the first condition constrain the system such that there's an influence on P2 and the variety of mental states that come out? So how you think about it is that one of those mental states will grab our attention. One of those mental states will dominate for reasons that we don't quite understand, but they're certainly under the influence of our experience, of the environment, selecting things. It's the moment when everything that around us in our culture and our world influence which mental state, which then means it's going to constrain the next row through time of what mental states may follow from that. And so I'll give you an example of kind of a startling example of how a mental state certainly defines how one responds to a upwardly causal system coming in a brain science setting. And these are patients that are operated on during the course of various tumor surgeries. And this work carried out by Dr. Mark Rayport in Ohio, he would put an electrode in a conscious patients are awake during a lot of neurosurgical procedures, and he would put an electrode in the olfactory bulb. For those of you out there who know anatomy, this is the only figure I could find. That's not the olfactory bulb, so forgive me that. But he would stimulate, he would put an electrode in the olfactory bulb, and then he would, and the patient didn't know any of this and was completely unaware of this whole part of it. And the physician would say, tell us about something pleasant. Think about something pleasant. He says, oh, you know, oh yeah, it's a wonderful afternoon. I'm sitting on the front porch. And then unbeknownst to the patient, the doctor would stimulate, and all of a sudden he'd interrupt after the stimulation and say, who brought the rose into the room? Oh, well, it's a wonderful smell. Okay? So the doctor leaves the electrode in the same place, same stimulation parameters, all that kind of stuff, and a little while later changes the mental set of the patients and says, you know, think of something terrible, or think of something that's upsetting you. And the patient says, oh, well, you know, and goes off on some story about some tension at work or something. And then again, the stimulation is turned on unbeknownst to the patient. And all of a sudden the patient says, who brought that rotten egg into the room? What is that? It's terrible. Get that smell out of here, you know. So my head's open. So by changing the mental state of the patient, the same exact physical state underneath of it is given a different interpretation. So here we have this constellation of mental states bobbing around in us at all time, being driven by these multiple brain systems. Here we have all these bottom-up influences occurring, and for some reason, at some point, one of the mental states is dominating, and when a bottom-up influence comes, the response is made consistent with the mental states that happens to be dominating at that moment. How that domination occurs, as I've said time and time again, I don't think we truly understand, but it's certainly influenced by all the things we do, by the practice that we engage in, by the thoughts that we carry, by the things that come from that priming of those kinds of ideas, and so forth. So I broached, in my final thought here, is I broached really one of the world's leading neuroscientists, good friend, Bill Newsom, William T. Newsom, and I asked him, you know, what do you think about this emergent properties? How are emergent properties studied? And Bill said, I believe in emergence and ultimately in the idea of downward causation. My question is, where does one stick the electrode to study it with scientific rigor? And he's got a point. How on earth do you capture that? But he went on to say that I don't think that downward causation is likely to be studyable with single electrodes. Downward causation will have the form of a higher state of the nervous system governing the action of single units. The goal will be to discern the underlying unitary state of the system via the many noisy looks we get via the individual electrode. So he's really saying that the single electrode approach is going to continue to define the underlying landscape, but there's really a new science to be done. There are going to have to be new techniques developed to capture these higher states, and those will be the things to be understood in trying to find out the forces that go into our cognitive and phenomenal awareness. So to sum up, here's how I would argue. A setting of course of action is automatic, deterministic, modularized, and driven not by one physical system at any one time, but by hundreds, thousands, perhaps millions. The course of action taken appears to us as a matter of choice, but in fact is the result of a particular emergent mental state being selected by surrounding milieu, resulting in a course of action. That is how that's how the brain works. Thus, downward causation is the match between ever-present multiple mental states and the impinging contextual forces within which it functions. Our interpreter then claims we freely made a choice. Now, it gets more complicated. because we're going to now have to consider the importance of the social context within which we live, and how the social constraints on all this system that I've defined in terms of an individual psychological entity also plays into this game. And that will be the subject of tomorrow night's lecture. And as you can, of course, tell, we're all under constraints, even fish, that somehow there's something going on at the group level that constrains how and where they swim. Thank you.
Am I first? I guess I'm first. Mike?
Yeah, there you go.
So you gave a lot of examples of why we should think that there are epistemic problems with reductionism, but nothing that you said so far has undermined the metaphysical issue of determinism, it seems. So what you've pointed out is that there are epistemic limits, but if I were a hard determinist, I could still say, you know, emergence, schmemergence, it's all the same. Everything's determined and everything happens because of causal laws, right? So does anything that you say contradict the metaphysical problem of determinism?
No, I don't think so. But what it does say in the question of personal responsibility is that where do you look for it? You don't look for it in the brain, you look at it in the interaction of groups. And so this becomes highly important when you're considering certain legal questions, I think. That you have to know where to find responsibility. You're not going to find evidence for diminished responsibility, particularly in the brain. People want the responsibility center. Is that lesion? Is there a problem with it? No, that's not where the game's being played. The game is being played in the interaction of people, and I suppose that is the approach. But your point, the emergence.
It only has bite if you are a hard determinist.
Yeah. Well, right. What do you think about that? I don't know if I can squirm out of that one or not. I think. Yeah. Good question.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I found today's lecture very stimulating, but thinking of it as a continuation of the previous stuff, I still haven't heard anything that convinces me that the narratives constructed by the interpreter are, as you were saying today and as you were hinting last time, an illusion. You said the last time that the interpreter is only as good as the information it gets, and you gave us examples of cases where it doesn't get the information for various reasons. But what if it does get the information? If it's sometimes constructing a rationalization after the fact, which it thinks is a reason, that doesn't mean that it never has access to a reason if the information is available.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, it normally is doing its job. Yep. I put food outside of my cave last night. It's not there today. I wonder. Let me try to figure that out. You know, and the rational process works. So that's what makes us figuring out patterns is what we do all day long. And we can just trick the system, and then the system tricks us by, like in the example I gave, a clinical example I gave of a panic attack. You're sitting there having a perfectly rational moment in a perfectly rational place in a restaurant, and all of a sudden we goose up your brain through some collision of stimuli that we don't understand, and we get a sense of free-floating anxiety. And we immediately hypothesize, I hate this feeling, I do not want this feeling again. It must be that restaurant. It must be that, or who I was with, and the phobias start. We immediately theorize. So that's where we've tricked it to not be playing to our better use, but normally it does. I'd say I think that's its fundamental purpose.
In the case of the supposed illusion of conscious choice, though, I mean, is this a special category? Is that always an illusion? And is it the fact that you've got this post hoc character of either the pinpointing of the moment of decision or the reporting of the moment of decision that gives us that illusory character? Because if that is what establishes the nature of the illusion, then there are possible answers. I mean, you could simply say that what you're measuring is just reaction time, or you could come back with a response that makes the event bigger than you're saying it is. For example, I'm thinking of the things where someone is told that at some time in the next 10 minutes they're going to have to press a button. And then, you know, at some time they do decide to press the button. You've got the 500 millisecond delay and all the rest of it. But they have already, in some sense, decided to press the button at the point at which they agreed to take part in the experiment.
Right.
And decisions are maybe just bigger than a single point in time.
Yeah. Well, one tries to bring these under experimental control in the kind of experiments I'm talking to you, and I'm going to press the button tomorrow at noon. It's not one of them. but no, I mean, here's the fundamental fact. I don't think any of us can get away from the fundamental fact that by the time you're consciously aware of something, your brain's already done it. How else could it be? And because of that, I mean, that's just like kind of physics 1, okay? Now, phenomenally, we just don't think we're just sitting watching life, right? We think we are moving it around. We are part of it. So that's psychological fact 1. So how do you put these two things together? Well, have we evolved to back refer things in time? So I'm just suggesting that as something that, and in fact there's experimental evidence of that kind of thing from Lau. But that's the idea. I'm suggesting that's what's evolved to make us feel that we're in charge. I don't know. I mean, both facts are true. Interpretation is what I'm offering. I mean, both statements I feel are factual and true.
A little second question here. One just behind and then one at the back there. Actually, the other order.
Oh, sorry. Who's it? Sorry.
Yes. I guess when you're trying to distinguish two theories, you want to get them in the position where they're making different predictions. And I was wondering, in the case of where the person has the same electrode go off in their brain and on the one hand thinks it's a rose and the other an egg, would our theory, so I'm a harsh reductionist thinking the brain is doing this, I'd predict that a bunch of cells in the brain are in a bad mood and will interpret things badly. And so I'd predict that they'll do those behaviours. And then the person who took Descartes seriously would make the prediction that my mental state will come down and affect my interpretation. So we're not making different predictions. How do you get the two theories to predict different things?
Yeah. If there was the notion, I guess I was trying to get at there is that, and it's probably not even true, in the sense that the stimulation of the electrode in those two conditions probably finds the brain in a totally different state, actually, because of this. If the gastric system of the lobster has 200,000 possibilities in any second of firing to produce something, and you look at our complexity, those two states are not going to be the same. But so just imagining it's the case in state 1 versus state 2, I would think the upwardly causal person would not predict that same stimulation state would produce a different phenotypic response. That could only be explained by there being another process in there intervening that comes still from the determined system. Maybe that example doesn't work for you, but that's what I was trying to get at.
Hello. You made the very interesting point that
to ask a question to study X, Y, or Z might depend where you put the electrode. That made me think, suppose you wanted to make an intervention, you could ask the same question: where do you make the intervention if you want to change a mental state? I'm thinking of mental illness and the search for what the popular press calls the gene for schizophrenia, or continued pharmaceutical interventions to treat certain forms of mental illness. So the question is, do you think this kind of view of emergent mental states makes a difference to where you would make an intervention if you wanted to change something in the psychosocial world of individuals?
That's a great question. I mean, we do know now that there are, in deep brain stimulation work, there's a whole rash of new studies that suggest that various sites of clinical depression can be found and alleviated with stimulation. But that's different from the question you're asking. That's where they're just saying if there's a combinational manipulation of mental state with this, you might achieve some greater efficiency. I don't know. But it would seem to, I don't know.
Yeah. One more question, right there. Let's have two more questions. Okay, that one and then one more.
Hi, I'm asking the same question I asked in the last lecture, which is that, taking the example of the ants that you showed earlier, would you say the group of ants working together to construct the anthill, having a collective intelligence or a collective consciousness or a collective personhood, is the same as one ant and all its brain systems, discrete brain systems, working separately or together to have one consciousness?
No.
Why? What's the difference?
I mean, that's like wondering whether the group of 13 billion neurons in my head that all play an active role in making me have a conscious moment are all in and of themselves conscious of what they're doing. I think that's patently wrong.
So you're saying the group of neurons coming together have one kind of consciousness, but the group of ants coming together...
No, I don't think they are conscious. I don't think that's where you look for the solution to finding the physical instantiation of the conscious phenomenon is in a neuron or two neurons. It's in some neuronal mechanism that enables the phenomenal consciousness, but you wouldn't say the elements that enable it are conscious of the fact that they're doing that. That's just simple.
Last question here.
Thank you. I'm an amateur at this field, so you'll be patient with my question, please. But come back to your analogy or your discussion of moving from quantum mechanics at the subatomic level up to the molecular level. It would be, am I right? It would be impossible to predict the physics, the laws of physics that operate at a molecular, supramolecular level on the basis of the physics that operate at a subatomic level. That is to say, it's almost as if when you move upward in a certain way, a different set of behaviors obtain.
That's Laughlin's point.
Yeah. Now, it still struck me that you were attempting to move upward from neuron behavior to social behavior or to mental states. Obviously, there's no other basis for it, in the same way that there's no other basis for molecular forms than subatomic forms. But can the behavior at one level adequately account for what we see at another level?
Yeah, you've restated the question is how do you represent in neurologic terms what is the right level of description to capture what goes on in the brain that underlies cognitive states. And there's an army of neuroscientists working hard to look at it at every level. But what is not commonly done is to build the relationship between those levels and to see where you actually should be fixated, where you should actually look for the explanation that explains the higher level. That's, for all the young students here, that's the $64 question of the next 200 years. We have glimpses of insight into this. That's all we have, little glimpses. We have fantastic knowledge about cellular interactions and all that. Fantastic knowledge. I mean, don't misunderstand me. It's when you try to go for the whole nut, you realize how limited your knowledge is. When you're studying ocular motor control mechanisms, when you're studying brain mechanisms involved in spatial location, there's a tremendous amount of knowledge about all that stuff. But when you really try to take it to the other level of how you actually should limit your description at the brain level to explain at a higher level, that is, there's lots of room for discussion and debate and hard work. So.
Okay, on that note, I think we should have an emergent round of applause.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.